On the morning of March 14th, 1955, a detective named Raymond Alcott arrived at a warehouse on the western edge of the South Bronx, summoned by a phone call that had come in at 6:47 a.m. He had been a homicide investigator with the NYPD for 11 years. He had seen things that stayed with him. But when he stepped through the warehouse door that morning, he stopped walking. 5 men, all of them found within a 30-foot radius. All of them connected by name and by affiliation to the organized crime network operating out of East Harlem and the lower Italian neighborhoods of Manhattan. All of them, according to the medical examiner who arrived 2 hours later, deceased within the same approximate window, somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning. Detective Alcott stood in that warehouse for a long time before he said anything. Then he turned to the officer beside him and said something that would become, in the years that followed, one of the most quietly famous lines in the oral history of the NYPD's relationship with Harlem's underworld. "Find out," he said, "if anybody did something to upset Bumpy Johnson." The officer looked at him. "Just find out," Alcott said again. He was right to ask, because in the 48 hours before those 5 men were found in that South Bronx warehouse, something had happened on a sidewalk on 128th Street in Harlem. Something involving a man named Tony Delucci, a pregnant woman named Mayme Johnson, and a set of words spoken in public that should never have been spoken at all. Tony Delucci was not the most powerful man in the Italian criminal networks that operated in and around Harlem in 1955. He was not a boss. He was not even a capo. What he was connected. And more importantly, what he was the kind of man who had confused being connected with being untouchable. This was a mistake that men in his world made with a reliable frequency, and it almost always ended the same way. On the afternoon of March 12th, 2 days before Detective Alcott stood in that warehouse, Tony Delucci encountered Mayme Johnson on the sidewalk outside a pharmacy on 128th Street. Mayme was 7 months pregnant. She was there on an ordinary errand, the kind of ordinary errand that a woman living in Harlem ran on a Wednesday afternoon. She was not looking for trouble. She was not representing her husband's interests. She was simply a woman who needed to pick up something from a pharmacy and go home. What Delucci said to her has been described in various ways across the years, in conversations that were later documented by journalists and historians who covered Harlem's organized crime history. The specifics varied in the telling, but the core of it was consistent. He insulted her, deliberately, with an audience present, in language that was designed not merely to offend but to degrade, and, through the degradation of Bumpy Johnson's pregnant wife, to send a message to Bumpy himself about where the real power in Harlem lay. The woman on the sidewalk said nothing. She turned and walked away. But the people standing nearby, the shopkeepers, the passers-by, the man who had been sweeping the stoop 3 doors down, they heard everything. And in Harlem, that meant that within the hour, Bumpy Johnson heard everything too. The clock started ticking at approximately 3:15 p.m. on Wednesday, March 12th, 1955. 48 hours later, 5 men were dead in a South Bronx warehouse, and Detective Raymond Alcott was standing in the doorway, trying to figure out where to begin. This is the story of what happened in between, and it is a story about far more than 5 bodies in a warehouse. It is a story about power, about what happens when men who believe they are protected by hierarchy discover that hierarchy has limits. It is a story about a community and a code, and a man who had built his entire world on the principle that certain lines, once crossed, carried a price that no connection and no family affiliation could cancel. It is the story of Bumpy Johnson, and it begins on a sidewalk on a cold March afternoon, with a pregnant woman and a man who didn't know when to stop talking. To understand why Tony Delucci's words on that sidewalk were so catastrophically miscalculated, you have to understand the landscape of organized crime in New York City in 1955, and specifically, you have to understand the particular geography of power that defined Harlem's relationship with the Italian mob families during that era. New York in 1955 was, in the language of organized crime, a divided city. The 5 Italian-American crime families, The Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families had carved the city into territories and revenue streams that were managed through a system of negotiated arrangements, tribute payments, and carefully maintained hierarchies. The Commission, established in 1931 following the violence of the Castellamarese War, provided a framework for resolving disputes and maintaining a functional peace between competing organizations. But Harlem was a special case. Harlem was a neighborhood of roughly 300,000 black residents that generated tens of millions of dollars annually through the numbers racket, the illegal lottery that was the economic lifeblood of black organized crime throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. The Italian families wanted access to that revenue. They had been trying, in various ways, since the early 1930s to absorb Harlem's numbers operations into their own structures. They had never fully succeeded. The reason they had never fully succeeded had a name: Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy. By 1955, Bumpy Johnson had been operating in Harlem for more than 2 decades. He had survived the Dutch Schultz era. He had survived multiple federal investigations. He had survived prison. He had survived the transition from one generation of Italian mob leadership to the next, navigating each shift with a combination of strategic intelligence and carefully calibrated shows of force. He had built an arrangement with the Genovese family, who, by the mid-1950s, were ascending toward dominance under the aging Frank Costello and the ambitious Vito Genovese, that allowed him to operate with a degree of autonomy that was essentially unique among black organized crime figures in America. This arrangement worked because both sides understood what they had. Bumpy provided access to Harlem's numbers economy. The Genovese organization provided a degree of protection from the other families and from certain law enforcement pressures. Each side needed what the other had. Each side, therefore, maintained a working respect. The key word is working. Not warm, not equal, but functional, and built on the understanding that both parties would honor the boundaries of the arrangement. Tony Delucci operated in the space between the Italian families and their Harlem operations. He was, in the hierarchy of the organization he was affiliated with, a mid-level figure, above the street soldiers and the runners, but far below the actual decision-makers. He managed relationships, collected payments, communicated between levels of the organization. He had been doing this for approximately 7 years, and in those 7 years, he had developed the particular kind of arrogance that comes from proximity to power without the responsibility that actual power requires. He had also developed, according to people who knew him from that era, a specific contempt for the black Harlem figures he dealt with. This was not unusual among Italian mob associates of that generation. The racism of mid-century America expressed itself throughout organized crime as thoroughly as it did throughout every other American institution. But most of the men in his organization who shared this contempt had the judgment to keep it compartmentalized. They understood that business required a certain pragmatic respect, even when personal feelings ran in the opposite direction. Delucci did not exercise that judgment. He made comments. He pushed against edges. He treated the people of Harlem's criminal community with a condescension that was noticed and documented in the oral histories of the era. Comments about black people's fitness for certain kinds of work, jokes made at the expense of Bumpy's associates, small performances of contempt that were always technically deniable, but never, in the rooms where they occurred, deniable at all. The people he directed these performances toward were careful in how they responded. They had to be. The power differential was real. Bumpy's arrangement gave him authority within Harlem, but did not give him license to respond to every provocation from Italian mob associates without risking the broader relationship that made his operation viable. Delucci had observed this carefulness. He had interpreted it with the logic of a man who mistakes tolerance for weakness as an indication that the provocation had no consequences. He had pushed, and no one had pushed back. He had spoken, and no one had replied in kind. He had, in his own assessment of the situation, established that he could say what he wanted around these people and nothing would happen. He was wrong, but he would not understand that he was wrong until it was far too late to matter. What he had not understood, what his contempt had prevented him from seeing, was that Bumpy Johnson was not absorbing these provocations because he lacked the power to respond. He was absorbing them because responding to each small insult was not worth the cost. In the calculus of power, there's a vast difference between choosing not to act and being unable to act. Delucci had never grasped that distinction. On March 12, 1955, he crossed a line that was not a small insult. He publicly degraded Bumpy's pregnant wife in Bumpy's neighborhood in front of witnesses. He had moved from provocation into something else entirely, a direct assault on the dignity and safety of someone Bumpy was responsible for protecting. He had made the private personal. He had made the implicit explicit. He had, in front of an audience on 128th Street, declared that Bumpy Johnson's protection extended no further than Delucci chose to allow it. This was not a mistake that patience could absorb. This was a different kind of line entirely. Let's talk about the men who were found in that warehouse. Their names, as they appear in the NYPD homicide records from March 14, 1955, were Anthony Ferrone, age 34, Joseph Sox Marinello, age 41, Carlo Iacovetti, age 29, Patrick Patsy Brancato, age 37, and Vincent DeLuca, age 33. All five were known to law enforcement as associates of organized crime. All five had prior arrests on charges ranging from assault to extortion to illegal gambling operations. All five were connected, in one way or another, to the network of which Tony Delucci was a part. They were, in the language of the organization they served, his crew, the people who executed his instructions, who carried his messages, who provided the physical presence behind his authority. Without them, Tony Delucci was a man with connections, but without the means to exercise them on the street. They were his power made tangible. Now let's talk about who Bumpy Johnson had around him in 1955. The inner circle of Bumpy's organization in the mid-1950s was not large. Bumpy had always believed in quality over quantity, in having fewer people who were absolutely reliable rather than many people whose loyalty was situational. By 1955, he had operated in Harlem long enough that the people closest to him had been tested repeatedly and had never failed. They were, by every account of the era, ferociously loyal. Loyal not merely out of financial interest, but out of genuine personal devotion to a man who had, at one point or another in most of their lives, done something important for them. There was a man referred to in historical accounts as Chess, real name documented but rarely used in historical records, who had been with Bumpy since the late 1930s and served as something between a chief enforcer and a personal secretary, managing the intricate logistics of Bumpy's daily operations. There was a network of street-level figures who owed their positions, and in some cases their freedom, to Bumpy's interventions. And there were the community relationships, the shopkeepers, the church leaders, the numbers players, the ordinary people of Harlem who provided the social infrastructure through which information traveled with extraordinary speed. When Mayme Johnson came home from the pharmacy on the afternoon of March 12th, she was, by accounts from people who were present, composed. She had not been shaken, at least not visibly. She came in, set down what she had bought, and told Bumpy what had happened. Bumpy Johnson listened without interrupting. This was his habit when receiving important information, a stillness that the people around him had learned to read carefully. The quality of his listening told you more than his words usually did. When Mayme finished, he asked her one question. Was she sure it was Delucci? She was sure. She knew his face from the occasions when he had come to negotiate with Bumpy. She was certain. Bumpy nodded. He thanked her for telling him. He asked if she was all right and whether she needed anything. Then he told her he was going to step out for a few hours. Those few hours were the beginning of the 48-hour sequence that ended in the South Bronx warehouse. What Bumpy did during those hours, the conversations he had, the decisions he made, the people he spoke with, and what he said to them, was never fully documented in any official record. The NYPD's subsequent investigation into the warehouse deaths, which ran for several months before stalling without arrests, produced no clear picture of Bumpy's movements in the critical window between March 12th and 14th. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, which had an ongoing interest in Bumpy Johnson and maintained files on his activities throughout the 1950s, similarly documented nothing specific about this period. What exists instead is the oral record, the accounts passed down through the community, through the people who were adjacent to the events, through the secondary witnesses who spoke to journalists and historians in the years and decades that followed. These accounts are not uniform in their details, but they are remarkably consistent in their broad outlines. And those broad outlines tell a story about a man who did not act in rage, who did not act impulsively, and who did not act alone. Bumpy Johnson, in the hours after Mayme told him what had happened on 128th Street, did something that distinguished him from most of the men in his world. He thought about what Tony Delucci had done and what it meant. He thought about the options available to him and the costs associated with each one. He thought about the message that any given response would send, not just to Delucci, not just to the organization Delucci was affiliated with, but to Harlem, to the community that watched him, measured him, and made their assessments of what his protection was actually worth based on how he responded to moments exactly like this one. And he thought about something else, something that Delucci, in his arrogance, had not considered at all. He thought about who, in the organization above Delucci, would actually want to go to war over a man who had publicly degraded a pregnant woman on a Harlem sidewalk. The answer to that question was the key to everything that followed. In organized crime, as in most institutions that run on hierarchy and reputation, there are acts that can be defended and acts that cannot. The distinction is not always obvious from the outside, but it is acutely understood from within. Acts that can be defended are acts with strategic logic, moves made in the interest of business, of territory, of money, of maintaining or advancing the organization's position. Even violent acts, even brutal ones, can be defended if they can be explained in terms of organizational interest. The commission that governed New York's organized crime families existed precisely to adjudicate these kinds of situations, to determine whether a killing was sanctioned, whether a territorial move was legitimate, whether a response to a provocation was proportionate. Acts that cannot be defended are acts driven purely by personal contempt, personal ego, or personal recklessness, with no organizational justification. Acts that create problems without generating benefits. Acts that make the organization look undisciplined, uncontrolled, and therefore unreliable as a partner in the intricate systems of negotiation and mutual dependence that kept New York's organized crime ecology functional. What Tony Delucci had done on the sidewalk of 128th Street on March 12, 1955, was definitionally, unmistakably, in the second category. He had not been acting in the organization's interest. He had not been sending a message that his superiors had authorized or would have authorized if asked. He had not been conducting business of any kind. He had been indulging his contempt, his personal, privately held contempt for a black woman and, through her, for her husband, in a setting where it could not be justified, explained, or defended by anyone with the organizational standing to try. Bumpy Johnson understood this with a clarity that came from decades of operating within the same system. He understood it the way a chess player understands a board, not emotionally, but structurally. And what the structure told him was this: the people above Tony Delucci did not want a war over Tony Delucci's behavior. They wanted what they had always wanted: a functional relationship with Harlem's numbers operations, reliable stream of revenue, a minimal amount of friction and attention. What they did not want was a man of Delucci's rank turning Harlem into a source of instability because he couldn't control his mouth. In the 48 hours that followed Mayme's account of what had happened, Bumpy made contact through the layers of intermediary communication that organized crime relied on for sensitive negotiations, with someone who had the standing to send a message in the other direction. Not a confrontation, not a demand, a communication, a laying out of what had occurred, with the implicit question of whether the organization wished to stand behind it. The silence that came back, the absence of any protective response from the people who should have deployed it if they intended to deploy at all, was its own kind of answer. Meanwhile, on the street, Tony Delucci was apparently unaware that this communication was occurring. By account from people in his circle during those 2 days, he was operating normally, conducting his usual business, meeting with his usual associates, eating at his usual spots. He had not gone to ground. He had not made any unusual security arrangements. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, given what he had done on 128th Street a second thought. This detail, his normalcy, his apparent lack of concern, was, in retrospect, one of the most striking elements of the entire episode. It spoke to the depth of his miscalculation. He genuinely did not believe that what he had said to Mayme Johnson would have consequences. He had been saying things like that for years. Nothing had happened. Nothing would happen now. He was still reasoning from the wrong premises. He still believed that the tolerance he had encountered from Bumpy's people over the years was a permanent condition rather than a strategic choice. He still believed that his connection to the organization made him untouchable. He had, in the 48 hours between his words on 128th Street and the discovery of his crew in the South Bronx warehouse, exactly one moment where he might have realized his error. According to one account, sourced to a man who was present in the room at the time and who spoke about it years later, someone who knew both Delucci and Bumpy's world tried, on the evening of March 12th, to quietly suggest to Delucci that what had happened was serious, that he should perhaps make a gesture, that he should perhaps find someone who could communicate to Bumpy Johnson that the incident had been a mistake. Delucci, according to this account, laughed. "He's a numbers man," Delucci said. "He runs a gambling operation. What's he going to do to me?" The man who had tried to warn him did not press the point. There are moments when you understand that the person you're trying to help has already made a decision that cannot be unmade, and all you can do is step away from the blast radius. He stepped away. What happened next unfolded with the terrible precision that distinguished Bumpy Johnson's responses from those of lesser men. There was no frenzy. There was no public confrontation. There was no moment that could be pointed to and used as evidence in a courtroom. There was simply, at some point in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning on March 14th, an accounting. A careful, organized, total accounting. The kind that sent a specific kind of message, a message that was far more sophisticated than simple revenge, a message that said, "I know who stand behind you, and I know they won't stand behind this .5 man." Detective Raymond Alcott's investigation into the South Bronx warehouse deaths ran for 6 months. It produced thousands of pages of documentation, dozens of interviews, and exactly 0 arrests. This was not, by any standard, unusual in the context of organized crime investigations in 1950s New York. The cases that ended in convictions were the exceptions. The cases that ended in file drawers, in unsolved folders, in the permanent limbo of investigations without witnesses willing to testify, those were the rule. The criminal ecosystem of New York in that era had developed, over decades, an extraordinary capacity for the production of untestable theories and unprovable suspicions. Everyone understood what had happened. No one could prove any of it in a way that would hold up before jury. What Alcott found in the course of his investigation is instructive, not for what it proved, but for what it suggested. He found, first, that Tony Delucci himself had disappeared. Not dead, at least not provably so, not in any location that the investigation could establish. Simply gone. His apartment was found in normal order. His personal belongings were largely undisturbed. He had last been seen, according to accounts from people in his building, on the evening of March 13th, going out, as he apparently said, to meet someone. He was not seen again. No body was ever officially connected to him. No death certificate was issued in his name in any jurisdiction that the NYPD was able to canvass in the course of the investigation. Tony Delucci, for all purposes of the official record, simply ceased to exist sometime after the evening of March 13, 1955. Alcott found, second, that the organization to which Delucci and his 5 associates belonged had, within approximately 72 hours of the warehouse discovery, communicated through various informal channels that it did not consider the warehouse incident a matter requiring a response. This was extraordinary. 5 men connected to the organization had been killed in a way that 0 survivors. And a message, written not in words, but in a language of consequence, that every person in the organized crime ecosystem of New York City would read with complete clarity. If you're finding this story as gripping as it is, pause for a moment and share it with someone who appreciates real history. Not the Hollywood version, but the documented, complicated, human truth of what power looked like in 1950s New York. This kind of storytelling only survives if people like you pass it forward. The morning of March 14th came. Detective Alcott got his phone call at 6:47 a.m. And in Harlem, the day began the way it always began, with the sounds of the neighborhood waking up, with people going about their lives, with the city turning over into another ordinary Thursday. Except nothing about this Thursday was ordinary. And the people of Harlem, processing the news that moved through the neighborhood's informal networks with its usual speed, understood that. They understood it the way they understood most things about Bumpy Johnson. Not through official channels, not through the newspapers, not through anything that could be quoted or cited, but in the bone, in the particular quality of silence that a community maintains when it is simultaneously shocked and not surprised at all. Clearly implicated professional planning and execution, and the people above them in the hierarchy had looked at the situation and decided, with the cold practicality that defined organized crime decision-making at its highest levels, that this was not their problem. The reason for that decision was understood without being stated. Delucci had acted without authorization. Delucci had created a problem without generating any benefit for the organization. Delucci had, by insulting Bumpy Johnson's pregnant wife in public, put the entire Harlem revenue arrangement at risk for no reason that anyone could explain in organizational terms. He had been a liability. The organization had not protected him. And the result, 5 dead men in a warehouse, 1 missing man, and a message delivered with crystalline clarity to everyone in the city who needed to receive it, was, from the organization's perspective, a clarification rather than an escalation. Bumpy Johnson had not started a war. He had ended one before it could start. He had struck precisely at the source of the problem in a way that the people above Delucci could process as a proportionate response to an unsanctioned action by one of their own. He had turned a potential catastrophe into a boundary-setting exercise. He had reminded everyone in the organized crime ecosystem of New York exactly where the lines around Harlem were drawn, and exactly what happened to people who crossed those lines without authorization. Alcott understood most of this. He documented it, in careful language that avoided naming names directly in his case files. He was a good detective. He was also a realist. He knew that the case would not be solved in any way that the criminal justice system recognized as solution. The people who would have needed to testify were not going to testify. The physical evidence was insufficient for prosecution. The organizational silence that had settled over the entire incident ensured that there was no path from suspicion to conviction. He closed the case in September 1955. The warehouse deaths of 5 organized crime associates remained officially unsolved. Unofficially, in the language of New York's underworld, they were as solved as anything ever was. The solution had been delivered, received, and acknowledged by everyone who mattered. Its author walked Harlem's streets every day. He ate in the neighborhood's restaurants, played chess in its parks, talked with the people who came to him with their problems. He was, to every outward appearance, a man living an ordinary life. But something had changed after March 1955. Something in the texture of the arrangements between Bumpy's operation and the Italian families. Something in the way that the men who came to Harlem to conduct business on behalf of those families conducted themselves. The condescension, by all accounts, did not disappear. Racism does not disappear because of a single event, no matter how dramatic. But the specific public theatrical contempt that Tony Delucci had embodied, the willingness to perform disrespect for an audience, to make the degradation of black Harlem figures into a social act, a demonstration of who held power over whom. That became, in the months and years after March 1955, measurably less common. People who had been present in both worlds, who moved between Harlem and the Italian neighborhoods of Manhattan and the Bronx, noted the change. The men who came to Harlem on behalf of the families were more careful, more formal, more inclined toward the kind of transactional respect that business required. It was not warmth. It was not equality, but it was something of recognition finally absorbed at a functional level, that there were limits even within the existing hierarchy, that Bumpy Johnson's patience had limits, that those limits, once reached, had consequences that the organization itself would not protect you from. Tony Delucci had been the lesson, and the lesson had been learned. In the spring of 1955, a few weeks after the warehouse discovery, a journalist named Marcus Webb, who covered Harlem for one of the smaller black newspapers operating in New York at the time, attempted to write about what had happened. He had sources in the community. He had heard the broad outlines of the story. He had enough to construct a narrative that, while careful about specifics, made clear the connection between Delucci's behavior and the subsequent events. His editor killed the piece. Not because the story wasn't true, not because the facts were wrong, but because in 1955, a black newspaper publishing a story that implicitly celebrated organized crime violence, even violence directed at a man who had publicly degraded a pregnant black woman, was a story that invited trouble from multiple directions simultaneously. From law enforcement, who would see it as evidence of community support for criminal activity. From the Italian mob networks, who would see it as a provocation. From the civil rights organizations that were beginning to gain traction in those years, who were working hard to present black communities in a light that was as far from organized crime as possible. The story sat in a drawer. Marcus Webb moved on to other things. The community, which did not need the newspaper to understand what had happened, processed it through the oral networks that had always been more reliable and more honest than the official press anyway. What this episode reveals, the killed article, the editorial calculation, the silence of the official record, is something important about the nature of power in its documentation. The things that actually shape communities, the moments that actually define who holds authority and on what terms, are often precisely the things that never make it into the official record. They exist instead in memory, in story, in the way that communities understand themselves and their history. For Harlem in 1955, the warehouse story was one of those moments. It became part of the understanding, part of what people knew, even if they couldn't prove it, about what Bumpy Johnson was and what it meant that he was the man he was. It joined the body of knowledge that the community carried about its own history, its own relationships with power, its own capacity for self-protection in a world that had made clear through every official institution available to it that official protection was not forthcoming. This is a good moment to sit with something that the story so far has been circling without quite landing on. Mayme Johnson, who had stood on that sidewalk on March 12th and heard what Tony Delucci said, and who had come home and told her husband what had happened, she did not ask Bumpy to do what he did. She had not demanded consequences. She had simply told him the truth of what had occurred and trusted him to respond as he saw fit. This distinction matters, because the mythology that grows up around stories like this one often casts the woman at the center of it as a passive object, as the thing that was insulted, the thing whose violation triggered the response, a prop in a story whose real actors are men. That is not who Mayme Johnson was. Mayme Johnson was a woman who had chosen to marry a man whose life was defined by exactly the kind of impossible contradictions that this story embodies. She was not naive about what that meant. She understood that she was, by virtue of that marriage, a target, a leverage point, a way to reach Bumpy through someone he loved. She had understood this for years and had lived with it, navigated it, maintained her dignity within it. The composure with which she came home that afternoon, the clarity with which she described what had happened, the matter-of-fact quality of her account. These were not the responses of a frightened or helpless person. They were the responses of someone who had been living in proximity to danger for a long time and had developed, through that proximity, a specific kind of steadiness. She was pregnant. She had been publicly degraded by a man who believed he could do so without consequence. And she had walked home with her groceries and told her husband what she needed to tell him, and let the rest of it go. That is its own kind of strength, a kind that the story of Bumpy Johnson, in most of its tellings, does not give enough credit to. What followed in the months after March 1955 was on the surface ordinary. Bumpy continued his operations. The arrangement with the families downtown continued. The numbers ran. The money moved. The streets of Harlem went about their life. Mayme gave birth to their daughter. The child came into the world in May 1955 in a Harlem hospital 2 months after the events on 128th Street and in the South Bronx warehouse. By all accounts, she was healthy. By all accounts, Bumpy was present. By all accounts, the man who was feared from one end of New York's underworld to the other sat beside his wife in a hospital room and held a newborn child and was, for those hours, simply a man, not a legend, not a symbol, not a demonstration of anything. Just a man who had done what he felt he needed to do to protect his family, and who was now on the other side of it, sitting with what he had protected. The people of Harlem heard about the birth the way they heard about most things, through the network, through the informal lines of communication that were the neighborhood's real nervous system. And there were people who allowed themselves, privately, to make the connection between the events of March 12th and 14th and the child born in May. Between the insult on the sidewalk and the stillness that had followed it. Between the price that had been paid and the new life that had arrived. They were not wrong to make that connection. That was exactly the connection Bumpy had intended. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, in a Harlem restaurant. He was 62 years old. He left behind Mayme, his daughter, and a Harlem that was in the middle of its own transformations. The civil rights movement had reshaped the political language of Black America. The Great Society programs were beginning to flow money into communities like Harlem, and the heroin epidemic was doing the kind of damage to urban Black communities that no political program would fully address. He also left behind a legend. And in the years and decades since his death, that legend has been examined, challenged, celebrated, and debated in ways that tell you as much about the people doing the examining as about Bumpy Johnson himself. The story of March 1955, Tony Delucci, the sidewalk on 128th Street, the warehouse in the South Bronx, sits at the center of that legend. It is in many ways the story that most completely captures what Bumpy Johnson was, the speed of the response, the precision of it, the organizational intelligence behind it, the message it sent, and to whom and in what language. But it also raises the questions that any honest engagement with his life must raise. 5 men died in that warehouse. 5 men who, by all accounts, had been involved in organized crime, who had chosen, for reasons of their own, to affiliate themselves with organizations that trafficked in violence and exploitation. This does not make their deaths insignificant. They were human beings. They had families. They had lives that extended beyond their criminal affiliations. Whatever they had done, whatever world they had chosen to operate in, their deaths were real losses to the people who loved them. This is the territory that mythology cannot comfortably occupy, but that honest history must. Bumpy Johnson was not simply the protector of a community. He was also someone who ordered violence, organized, calculated violence against people who, whatever their own crimes, had not personally done anything to justify the magnitude of the response they received. Delucci had insulted Mayme. His crew had not been present on 128th Street. They died, according to the evidence available, because of their association with a man who had crossed a line that Bumpy had decided must be answered. Is this justice? By no formal definition, by no standard that the legal system would recognize. These are the uncomfortable ledger entries that the legend prefers not to examine. And yet, and this is the same irresolvable tension that appears in every honest account of Bumpy Johnson's life. The context in which these events occurred was not one in which the formal justice system was available to Mayme Johnson or anyone else in Harlem who had been wronged. The NYPD did not arrest Tony Delucci for what he said on that sidewalk. No law criminalized his words. No institution stood between a pregnant woman and a man who chose to degrade her in public, backed by the implied threat of organized crime's hierarchy. The community's protection, such as it was, came from Bumpy Johnson and from no one else. This is the impossible arithmetic that his story presents. You cannot fully endorse what he did. You cannot fully condemn it without acknowledging what it replaced, which was nothing. An absolute absence of protection. A vacuum into which, if Bumpy Johnson had not acted, the lesson that would have been absorbed by everyone in Harlem would have been the opposite lesson. That Bumpy's protection had limits that Delucci could exploit, that the women of a neighborhood were not safe from the contempt of men who believed the hierarchy gave them license. That being Bumpy Johnson's wife in her 7th month of pregnancy was not enough to shield you from a man who simply didn't care. That lesson, absorbed into the community's understanding of itself and its situation, would have had its own costs. Costs that don't appear in any official record, that don't show up in any homicide file, but that are real nevertheless. The oral historians who documented Harlem's history in the 1970s and 1980s, the academics and journalists and community members who went back and spoke with the people who had lived through the era, found a consistent thread in the accounts they collected. When people talked about Bumpy Johnson, they talked about safety, not in an abstract sense, not as a theoretical condition, but as a lived daily reality. Women who had lived in Harlem during Bumpy's years described what it meant to walk certain streets, to patronize certain businesses, to exist in a neighborhood where someone was paying attention. Someone who, if you were disrespected in a way that crossed a certain line, would hear about it, would respond, would ensure that the disrespect had not been without consequence. This is not a romantic description of organized crime. It is a description of what community protection means when it is exercised by the community itself in the absence of any external provision of it. It is a description of what Bumpy Johnson, with all his contradictions and all his costs, actually provided to the people around him. His daughter grew up in Harlem. She grew up knowing the story of who her father was. The full story, not the legend, with all its complications and all its weight. She has spoken, in the years since his death, about what it meant to be Bumpy Johnson's child, about the pride and the complexity and the burden of that inheritance, about a man who was not simple, who could not be summarized, who occupied a space in the life of Harlem that no clean moral verdict could adequately describe. Mayme Johnson lived until 2009. She outlived her husband by 41 years. She saw the neighborhood change around her, saw the crack epidemic of the 1980s do more damage to Harlem than anything Bumpy had presided over in his 30 years of operations, saw the gentrification of the 1990s and 2000s transform the physical and demographic landscape of the neighborhood, where she had been publicly degraded by Tony Delucci on a cold March afternoon in 1955, saw her husband become a television character, a cultural symbol, a name that people who never knew Harlem could recognize. In the rare interviews she gave in her later years, she was careful. She acknowledged the difficulty of what their life had been. She did not glamorize it. She did not pretend that the violence was without cost, that the choices Bumpy made were made without consequence, that the world they lived in was one she would have chosen if choice had been freely available. She was honest about the weight of it, but she was also clear about something. She was clear that in a world that had told her and Bumpy and the community they lived in that their safety was not a priority, that their dignity was not something the institutions of American society were obligated to protect. Bumpy Johnson had made a different decision. He had decided that it was his priority, that their dignity was worth defending, that the lines around the people he was responsible for were real lines, not suggestions, not negotiations, not things that dissolve the moment someone with enough organizational backing decided to ignore them. Whether the way he defended those lines was right, was moral, was something we can endorse, those are questions that require more than a single verdict. They require the willingness to sit with the full weight of a complicated history and to resist the temptation toward easy conclusions in either direction. What is not complicated is the fact of what happened on 128th Street on March 12, 1955. A pregnant woman was publicly degraded by a man who believed she was beneath his consideration and her husband was beneath his fear. What happened next? The 48 hours, the warehouse, the silence of a New York spring morning was the answer to that belief. It was an answer that resonated in Harlem for decades. An answer that was never confirmed in any courtroom, never acknowledged in any official document, never published in any newspaper that lasted long enough for its archives to be preserved. But an answer that was known and remembered and passed down through the community with a particular kind of weight that truth carries when it travels through memory rather than through institutions. Bumpy Johnson was not a good man in any simple sense. He was a real one, embedded in his community, answerable to a code that was his own, operating in a world that offered him no clean choices and no safe positions. He made his choices and he lived with them, and Harlem lived with them alongside him. And when he died in that restaurant in July 1968, the neighborhood felt the loss as a community feels the loss of something that cannot easily be replaced, not because it was pure, but because it was present, because it was there in the daily reality of lives that official institutions had chosen not to see. That presence, that accountability, that willingness to answer when the answer was costly. This is what the story of March 1955 is ultimately about. Not 5 bodies in a warehouse. Not the calculations of organized crime. Not even Tony Delucci and his particular brand of fatal arrogance. It is about what it means to protect someone. What it costs. What it requires of the person who does it. And what it means to a community that has been told it does not deserve protection. To see that protection exercised imperfectly, contradictorily, at enormous moral cost, but exercised. Actually, truly, consequentially exercised. In 1955 Harlem, that was not a small thing. It was everything. The warehouse in the South Bronx was eventually demolished. The building is gone now, swallowed by the same economic and demographic transformations that reshaped every corner of New York in the decades after 1955. There is nothing there to mark what happened. No plaque, no memorial, no official acknowledgement of any kind. But in Harlem, memory works differently than plaques. It works through people, through the conversations that grandmothers have with grandchildren, through the stories that get told in barbershops and on stoops and in apartment kitchens, through the accumulated understanding that communities carry about what happened on their streets and what it meant. Memory in Harlem is not archived. It is lived. Bumpy Johnson is part of that lived memory in a way that no official recognition could fully capture and no official condemnation could fully erase. He was a criminal and a community figure simultaneously, inextricably, without the possibility of separating the two. He protected people and he exploited people, sometimes the same people, sometimes at the same time. He operated by a code that was entirely his own, borrowed from no philosophy, certified by no institution, answerable only to his own sense of what the community he lived in required of the person he was. The story of Tony Delucci and the warehouse and the 48 hours that changed Harlem's power landscape is a story about the collision between human dignity and human contempt, and about what happens when every official institution charged with mediating between them has already chosen, as the institutions of that era had chosen, to look the other way. When those institutions look away, communities do not simply accept the contempt. They find other means. Those means are costly, morally complicated, and impossible to fully endorse. But they are real, and the people who live through them carry the memory of it, what it cost, what it was worth, what it meant for the rest of their lives. Mayme Johnson carried it for 54 years. From a sidewalk on 128th Street in March 1955 to her final days in 2009, she carried the weight of what her husband had been and what he had done and what it had cost all of them. She carried it with the same steadiness that she brought to that ordinary Wednesday errand. The composure of someone who has lived close to danger long enough to stop performing courage and simply have it. That is the real legacy of those 48 hours. Not the warehouse. Not the missing man. Not the official case file that Detective Alcott closed without arrest in September 1955. The real legacy is the truth that the community carried forward. The knowledge that in a world determined to deny the people of Harlem their dignity, one man had said, with the particular language available to him, "Not here. Not this. Not her." And Harlem, which had seen too many things go unanswered to take anything for granted, remembered.